Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Adrian Pandev, business and immigration attorney, and today we're going to talk about the E1 versus the E2 visa. And if you're eligible for both, it is important to consider these differences because depending on the goals and needs of your business, it's important to choose the right one and not commit to the one that may not be the most advantageous to your business. Now, first and foremost, make sure you're actually eligible for both E1 and E2 visas. Make sure your country of citizenship has a treaty that qualifies you for both E1 treaty trader and E2 treaty investor visas. Some countries only have one. For example, Greece only has an E1, does not have an E2 visa. Similarly, many countries only have an E2 visa, but not an E1. Some off the top of my head are Albania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, but there's several others. So first and foremost, make sure you're actually eligible for both. First, let's talk about the E1 visa. The E1 is a treaty trader visa. So what that means is the government is looking at, for issuing the visa, whether there is substantial trade between the United States and the treaty country. So how is substantial trade defined? Well, it's defined as continuous flow of international items, so goods, as well as services between the treaty country and the United States. Important to keep in mind, there's no minimum monetary threshold. There's no minimum amount of trade that has to occur in order for it to be considered substantial trade. And there's no minimum monetary value of each specific transaction, right? Generally, the government looks at three criteria, right? The volume of trade, right? How many transactions there are. The value of trade, so what the value of each transaction is. Obviously, the higher the volume, the higher the transaction value, the better. And also, the government looks at continuity, right? So is it frequent, continuous trade, or is it just one or two, three transactions, right? The more transactions, the more frequent, the more continuous, the more likely the government will find that it is in fact substantial, right? One thing to note is often people think that the E1 is mainly for big companies, right? And there has to be huge transaction value. Think of large manufacturing or, import-export businesses, and that's not really the case. So high frequency of transactions, so high volume, lower value is often approved, right, for an E1 visa. Also important to notice, people get very focused on goods, right, the trade of goods, and don't look at the fact that it can be items or services, right, goods or services. So services where if, their services are continuously being sold into the U.S. or vice versa, from the U.S. into treaty country and back and forth, that works too, right? So don't only think of physical goods for an E1, services also qualify. So now let's contrast this with the E2 visa. The E2 visa is granted to those who have made a substantial investment into a U.S. business, into a U.S. enterprise. So a couple of requirements for the E2, right? The investment and the invested funds, they have to be at risk. They have to be committed and at risk. They can't just be sitting on a bank account. The business that you're investing in must be real and active and ready to operate, right? So that you can come in, receive this E2 visa and develop and direct the business. Also, your investment has to be substantial enough, right? Where it's not deemed marginal. And marginal is defined as a business that only provides for the investor and their family. So basically, the investment has to be substantial enough where the business has the capability to grow, where it can employ employees and create a living for others than the investor themselves. Okay, so now let's look at the key differences between the E1 and the E2 visa. So the key difference is the purpose. The E1 is for businesses that trade between the US and the treaty country. The E2 is for those treaty country citizens who've made a substantial investment, a capital investment, right, a cash investment into a U.S. business. Now, to make this very simple, think of it as trade versus investment. So what I tell everyone is look at what the business needs, right? So if you're on the fence, I'm not sure which one's better for my needs, look at what does your business need, right? So for example, if you already know that you need to make a capital investment. You need to invest cash in order to get the US business to grow and start and develop. For example, this could be you need to rent physical space like a warehouse or an office or a retail space, or it could be the purchasing of inventory or other products or hiring employees. If you know you have to make a cash investment, well, then the E2 is probably a good choice. However, what I see with many businesses and business owners, right, considering the E1 and E2 visas, is that they've already started a business that is selling into the US or selling out of the US into the treaty country, and there's already this selling of products or services in and out of the US. So in those cases, often there's no need for that initial capital investment. So if there's no need for that initial capital investment, and you've already, you know that the exchange, the transactions going back and forth between the US and the treaty country are already there and they're growing, well, then the E1 is probably a better choice, because if there's no need for a capital investment, the E2 is probably not the best visa option. And that way you can use the E1 to obtain work authorization and visa to live in the US. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful. I would really appreciate it if you hit the follow and like button if you found it helpful. If you have any questions or comments, just put them in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching.